Welcome to Accessible, where we open the door to the people and ideas shaping the disability community. I'm George Gatto.
And I'm Amelia Reigard.
On Accessible, we talk with leaders, advocates, researchers, and individuals with lived experience to explore the issues shaping the disability field.
Accessible is produced in partnership with the Missouri Leadership Education in Neurodevelopmental Disabilities, or LEND, and the Missouri University Center for Excellence in Developmental Disabilities, or UCED for short.
And whether you work in the field, are connected personally to disability, or simply want to better understand how systems can support people with disabilities, Accessible opens the door to conversations that matter. Well, we just had a really interesting conversation with Mark Wheatley from DESE, Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. He's the Assistant Commissioner for Special Education. I learned so much from that conversation. What'd you guys think?
Yeah, I learned so much too.
It was interesting to hear how Missouri Special School Districts runs and operates, and just I had no idea about. He talked about this working group that has formed recently called Missouri Special School District Reimagine, which is sort of their reorganization of that school district and or those districts or those school buildings. And that was just interesting to hear sort of what challenges Missouri has faced and also how they're kind of turning them into opportunities for new things.
I love that about it, the way he was framing things and just thinking about it. It's like, in every challenge there's opportunity. And so let's figure out what are those opportunities.
Mhm.
Yeah. Made me feel pretty good about, it made me feel good about the direction of special education in Missouri, because it's real easy to hear a lot of things that don't make you feel excited about it.
Yeah.
But hearing that, the guy who's sort of leading this process is excited, has a direction, and feels good about it. And, I think it's pretty neat. So,
Yeah. I think the other thing that he talked about too that is good to keep front of mind is we touched a bit on federal changes with the U.S. Department of Education. Of course, we've talked about that a couple times this season. And I think that it was a good reminder that even while federal organizations and entities are changing and morphing, that federal laws, unless they're changed, we are still obligated to them. And so when he was like, Missouri is obligated to the Individuals with Disabilities in Education Act, regardless of what happens with the U.S. Department of Education, and that's how we will continue to provide free and appropriate public education to students with disabilities, was encouraging. And it's just a good reminder that it would take an act of Congress to undo IDEA. And so while there's changes happening in terms of the entities in the federal level, it doesn't mean the law has changed.
Yeah, that was a
exactly.
really great point. And because it's so easy to get wrapped up in the fear of change that comes with change. And I thought that his point was really well taken, that the law isn't going to change. And
Right. And I think it's still good to
education's
be
gonna keep-
aware, right?
Mhm.
Because we, as citizens, we want to hold all of our public entities to the law, right? And hold them accountable. But it was a good thing to remember, right? So
Yeah, I agree. So I just, I really enjoyed talking with Mark, learning everything that he shared, hearing about his path. I thought that was
Mhm.
super interesting too. So I hope our guests will enjoy it. I'm sure they will, in fact. All right. Well, we are really excited today because we have Mark Wheatley with us. He's from Missouri Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. And I've known of Mark through a variety of things, but around the state. We had the opportunity to go and meet with him a few weeks ago, I guess, wasn't it, Mark? And I thought, now this is a guy who could really fill up a podcast interview. So we decided we should get in touch with you. So anyway, welcome to Accessible, Mark.
Thanks, George. Appreciate you having me on today. And yeah, I appreciate the plug, and we'll see how I do here. Nobody has suggested that I can't fill time with talk, so I think
That's
we're
right.
good.
Yeah,
It's their number one screening criteria, apparently.
that's right.
Fair enough.
Well, so you correct me if I'm wrong, Mark, if I get your title wrong, but you are the Assistant Commissioner of Special Education at DESE. Can you talk a little bit about that role and just how you got into this field?
Sure. Yeah, I am the assistant commissioner at the Missouri Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, and my office is special education. So all of our team here, we have about 35 Office of Special Education staff that work to support monitoring, supervision, technical assistance for LEAs across the state. But we talk a lot about our job as customer service. So we help families of students with disabilities. Hopefully, we have a direct line to those students with disabilities themselves, though oftentimes, as you can imagine, as young adults and children, we're supporting them and their families. And then we also look to support those school districts across the state in Missouri. And so, yeah, we get a little bit of the heavy responsibility of supervision and monitoring, but we really take the work of technical assistance and support um, with more weight, I think I would
Yeah.
say, within the districts. And so it's a really nice opportunity for us to connect with teachers in the field, special education directors across the state. And then we have several different advisory stakeholder groups that we work with that are all
Right.
focused on students with disabilities, primarily school age in our office. For those that aren't super familiar with IDEA, we primarily work with Part B
Uh,
IDEA here, which is really that 3 to 5 year old and then school age kindergarten through up to 21 in
uh-huh.
our office. And
Hey,
so,
you said you used a term before LEA. Can you talk a little bit or
yeah,
tell us what that acronym means?
yeah, good point. And I actually flipped it there. LEA is local education agency. So those are technically the school districts. And that's just an acronym that the U.S. Department of Education uses, is the local education agency. And so if you hear that, that's interchangeable with school districts and charter schools across the state. We do have some responsibility with IDEA as it relates to private schools, but in most cases, those aren't the same requirements around free and appropriate public education because they're parentally placed private in most circumstances. So little different rules around monitoring and supervision of those programs. But yeah, helping support those students with disabilities in education across the state of Missouri.
Yeah, we're gonna actually we'd like to ask a little bit more about that. We were talking about it before, but
Yeah.
before we jump there, can you talk a little just your background? How does a person get to be the commissioner of special education at
Yeah,
the
so
state
it's
level?
it's a funny route, and you'll hear that through my story a little bit today. But yeah, so I speak about the fact that when I came to education first, I was actually an elementary physical education teacher. Did that role for about 3 years in St. Joseph, Missouri, in St. Joseph Public Schools. Became an elementary principal there and worked in a Title I building for 7 years as an administrator in the elementary field. So I had early childhood special education, blended preschool, as well as then K through 6, supported students in that realm. Um, and then I took this crazy hiatus and opened a retail golf store for about 8 years. So 10 years in education, jumped, and I won't tell the lengthy story about that, but I've always enjoyed golf, and whether working in education or going to school and college to become an educator, was just always involved in golf, but not good enough to play. And so even while teaching, worked in the golf business, either at golf courses or retail golf, and so did that for 8 years. And I realized that that was a really nice hobby that didn't pay very well. Owning a golf store in Northwest Missouri was a tough gig, and so came back into education in the middle of the school year, which back in 2008, there weren't the vacancies for positions that there are now in education, and so I was thrilled to come across a position of an adaptive physical education teacher with the Missouri Schools for the Severely Disabled at Helen Davis in St. Joseph, Missouri. And so I tell people all the time my understanding and knowledge as it related to special education prior to that position was, as an elementary principal, I sat in the meetings with the SPED coordinator, process consultant, and the case manager in the elementary school that I was working at. But I relied heavily on those special education folks to do what was best for students. And um, as I look back now, I mean, gosh, I missed the mark in so many ways. Um, I just wasn't, I wasn't familiar with special education. Flip now to taking on the role as an adaptive physical education teacher at Helen Davis. Quickly got up to speed and learned a lot more than I ever could have learned in my undergrad work or even graduate work in administration, to get to that point where somewhere maybe about 3.5 years into that role as an adaptive physical education teacher, I was lucky enough to become the building principal at Helen Davis. And along the way, I really had to take advantage of the opportunity that I had to learn through trials and tribulations there what it meant to be a special educator. Um, and now that I look back, I don't know why I didn't do it in the first place, George. It was a blast getting to learn all about that side of education. That, like I said, I looked pretty and signed my name on during the IEP meetings, and that was the extent of my involvement when I was with St. Joe School District, and have worked really hard through that time with Helen Davis to understand the responsibility that I had as a building administrator in a school that served only students with extensive support needs. And I kind of acted as a little mini SPED director. And I give myself way too much credit because those folks who are special education administrators in Missouri have way more knowledge and way more experience than I ever did. But again, I had to fast track my own learning to to be fair, to do what was best for students at the time. And there was still a lot that I didn't know and didn't learn, but I knew that special education was the place that I wanted to spend the rest of my career in education. And then sometime after that, I think I had some success there as a building administrator, learned a lot about teaching and learning dynamics, particularly as it relates to students with extensive support needs, but also just got a better grasp for educational process, educational compliance around special education, and then some of that programming to where when I heard about this position at DESE, I was really excited to pursue the next step. And that seemed like a possible logical next step, knowing that I could not only now support students in one building, or in an area, because Helen Davis serves students, over several counties uh, in Northwest Missouri, to really having it what I think is an opportunity for a positive impact for students with disabilities throughout Missouri, at all levels. And so that's where I am now. And I've been here for 4 years almost. And again, look back at all of my experiences and don't think I'd changed the path, but probably missed an opportunity early on to explore special education that probably would have better informed my practice now.
That's interesting. I know we're going to get into kind of your role in special education broadly in Missouri here in a minute, but I just want to touch on your education background and your story of kind of how you ended up here. And uh, is that something that has come up a lot? I think through our interviews and these podcasts, is these discussions around different human service professions that where disability is such a niche area that it's almost as curriculum segregated from the rest of your general education. That's, I think, one of the things that makes Lend such a unique program. The program that sponsors this podcast is that you have this interdisciplinary group of future special education teachers, of PTs, OTs, whatever, and they're getting some foundational knowledge around disabilities to take into their career. And I guess I wonder,
just from your own experience, if you think that general education programs could do a better job, because general educators sit in IEP meetings all the time, right? Could they do a better job preparing general education teachers, or just all teachers and school administrators, to be prepared to understand disability legislation and how to support students and those things?
Well, yeah, Amelia, I think you hit the nail on the head there, right? I mean, as I've transitioned from the gen ed side to the special education side, first was the recognition that I didn't have a good grasp on special education or the needs of the students, understanding what my role could be to better support those students. And I mean, it's maybe sort of a cliche to say that all students are general education students first, but they really are. And I'm not sure that every educator in the general education setting has that perspective or sees it through that lens. And I mean, again, going back to my own experience, I probably didn't take that approach when I looked at how do you administer a program for 450 elementary school kids. I relied heavily on the special education or teachers and educators to do that work. And what we know is that really those students benefit most with disabilities if they are, directly connected to the core instruction by the general education teacher that has that expertise and the content knowledge, because we
Mhm.
know that we don't use specially designed instruction in place of core instruction. We use the core instruction, and then in addition to, we provide specially designed instruction to work our way around understanding and incorporation of that knowledge to meet those individual students needs. And so one thing that we'll talk about, I'm sure, later on in the show today, is the focus that we have in Missouri on ensuring that students have that access to the general education curriculum alongside their non-disabled peers. And what IDEA says is to the greatest extent appropriate. And we take that very seriously in Missouri. And without going into great detail, when you look at challenges, you always look at opportunity. And Missouri has a real opportunity to improve on practice. And we have some special educators and some general education administrators and teachers who are really excited about the potential to do that moving forward. But when we look at moving the needle in supporting academic outcomes that are positive for students with disabilities, we have to look to the general educators and work collaboratively as special educators with them to ensure that that happens, because I mean, honestly, it's sort of an untapped opportunity right now. And I think we all get caught up in what is our role in school. Um, and that's really tough to do when you have all sorts of accountability and accreditation for schools. And if we're looking at how we rank school districts based on performance and student outcomes, we have to be cognizant of the fact that 12 or 14% of those students are students with disabilities. And if we can improve and increase their outcomes, that has a huge impact on the overall outcomes for that school. And in fact, it can move the needle a great
Mm.
deal. And so you could probably tell I start to get excited about that. But it really
Yeah.
is critical. But that's not an easy thing to move if you don't have lots of folks that are already supporting that. So we're kind of starting right
Yeah.
now at a very grassroots level to incorporate and encourage more collaboration between the gen ed team and the special educators across the state in our school.
Oh, wow. So,
That's very cool.
Mark, you've mentioned a couple times the IDEA. Can you just briefly talk about what IDEA is and what it guarantees for students with disabilities?
Yeah, and I mean, first of all, so another acronym, right? I think
Yeah.
most of the folks that are listening to this podcast today know that, but if not, I'm glad to hear that we have some folks who are new to that, and it's the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. And it's really a pretty new law relative to other education law, right? We think back, in the 80s, and we were just celebrating the 50th anniversary of IDEA at the end of last year, beginning of this year. So it's only 50 years old. That means it's younger than I am.
Younger than me too.
But that's really important because prior to IDEA and Public Law 94-142, many students with disabilities were placed in other settings besides schools, and education was secondary to that at best. And so, with the introduction of IDEA, there were a lot of folks that were really forward thinking about how critical and I mean, how much of a right it is for every citizen in the United States to have access to a free, appropriate public education. So, in 50 years, though, if you look at that over the course of time, our work has really increased and improved in that area to where we got students to where they were engaged in public education first, because again, if they were in separate facilities and other places that weren't really providing educational opportunity, that was more care oriented,
Right.
that was a huge disservice to those students. Um, and now we've come all the way to where in the reauthorization of IDEA in the early 2000s, that's when we really saw a focus on more inclusive educational opportunities. So it's one thing to say students are in a program in a public school setting, but that didn't mean that they were alongside their non-disabled peers. And
Right.
IDEA and that legislation really, with that reauthorization, forced educators to begin to look at what does it mean to be more inclusive for students with disabilities alongside those non-disabled peers, access to the same general education curriculum that those non-disabled peers are accessing every day, and how can we do that in a way that is more beneficial to all students, and talk a lot about that and thinking about the fact that not only does it benefit the students with disabilities, but it benefits the general education students, the greater
Mhm.
school community. And when you think globally about a school community, there are lots of stakeholders involved in education, from the business community. And George, that's a big piece of your work, and
Yeah.
Catherine, you, I'm sure, as well, to where we really have to expand thinking about what education is and who all are
Mhm.
involved in education, and then ensuring that students with disabilities have that access and opportunity. Because when they leave us at
Yeah.
21, we want them to be a valued and strong member of the community and have that own self-worth and that own self-efficacy to be able to advocate for themselves in whatever it is that
Mhm.
they come up with to do when they do leave us in the educational realm.
Do you think that first I'll just say I am not originally from Missouri, and so when I moved here, I didn't understand what sort of the Missouri system was. So we have a special school districts. I think you said you had worked in one of those. In Can you talk a little bit about the special school districts, and how do those then align with allowing students with disabilities to have access to the curriculum?
Yeah, you were really tapping into something that's been a big shift in the way we're
Mhm.
thinking about, and you'll hear me talk about MSSD Reimagined. And MSSD is the acronym for Missouri Schools for the Severely Disabled. And I mentioned I
Uh-huh.
spent time there
Yeah.
working in those schools. And those are state operated schools that support students, educate students with extensive support needs. And they
Mhm.
are separate public placements. So
Mhm.
when I was an adaptive physical education teacher and when I was a building administrator, I was supporting solely students with extensive support needs, educating them in that separate placement. And if you look at the continuum of placement in special education, that's
Mhm.
common language that's discussed. You have students that spend most of their time in the regular education setting in their neighborhood schools with basically 20% or less of their time working closely with a special educator in specially designed instruction, all the way to the other end of the spectrum where you
Mhm.
have students that are placed in separate facilities, either public or private, based on what's appropriate and based on what their needs are. And then there's everything in between, right? And so when you think about Missouri, we are not unlike many states in
Mhm.
that, with the exception of about 6% of students with disabilities served in Missouri under IDEA, 94% are in their home school districts. Now,
Okay, great.
what that looks like is different for each student. Some may be right there in the classroom alongside their non disabled peers the whole day, but that continuum allows for supports as needed based on that disability to gain access to that regular general education curriculum to the greatest extent. And we use the term appropriate in
Right.
IDEA. Um, but then you also have a group of students who, based on their disability and their more extensive needs, are supported in a separate placement. And all of those decisions are made by the IEP team,
About
right?
okay, right.
And
Uh-huh.
so that IEP team, which is made up of the school district officials, the family, and the student, whenever possible and as
Mhm.
required as they get older,
Right.
um, they're looking at a number of factors to make those decisions. What I can say moving forward, though, that makes Missouri a little bit unique is that in addition to the school districts or those LEAs
Right.
providing those educational supports, Missouri has, for more than 50 years, for longer than IDEA has been in place, came up with the idea that they needed to develop schools to support and educate students who are on the more extensive needs spectrum.
Mhm.
And so traditionally, those students have been placed into those separate public schools. They're run by the state, they're funded through the state. I was a state employee when I was a building principal and when I was a
Uh-huh.
teacher.
Okay.
The buildings are owned by the state. And I remember spending time in that placement going, I still don't know much about special education relative to a lot of my peers, but
Right.
walking down the hallways, wondering to myself, is this really what's appropriate for the students that are in the building? And I can say with 100% certainty, some of those students do need 100% of their time with a very structured, supported network. But I can also, and I'll tell a quick story. I had a student
Sure.
that at Helen Davis would get off the bus every day. He'd go, "Good morning, Mark. How are you today?" And we'd have this conversation back and forth about the weather. And if it were cold, he would say how cold it is, and he was glad he had a coat on. Noticed I had a coat on. He would walk himself into the building. He would find his way to his classroom on his own. He could navigate the building well. Um, he had some really sound academic skills. As I
Mhm.
look back now in my role as the assistant commissioner, I'm not
Yeah.
so sure we did a service to that student. I
Mm.
think there was some benefit there. Now, you also have to look at each individual school district across the state of Missouri. Some are really small rural districts, some are big urban districts, some are suburban, and not every district is created equal as much as we would like
Right.
to say they are. And
Mhm.
so, what one district sees as an appropriate placement for a student, as an IEP team with that parent engaged in that conversation, other districts don't see that the same way. I
I
can
see.
look back now and reflect on that experience with that particular student and go, I think there would have been a great opportunity there for him to be in his local school district and
Uh-huh.
supported. But I will tell you, when his family was engaged in the IEP meetings, when the school district was engaged in the IEP meetings, they couldn't have they couldn't have come up with a rationale for him not being at Helen Davis.
Right.
But I think that's just all a perspective that you have to gain in seeing different opportunities and understanding the needs of students. But
Mhm.
so we are working through that MSSD Reimagined now because I think there are some students that, with the extra resources and the extra professional development, some of our local school districts could do a better job of supporting those students in their
Uh-huh.
home schools. And
Right.
so that's what we're really looking at doing now. And so that's really important work. And I can talk as much or as little about that as you
Yeah.
guys would like.
Well, am I wrong in thinking that some of your MSSD schools are being closed or that they're consolidating, or
Yeah.
how's that working?
You're absolutely correct. So, when I came to this office, MSSD was operating 34 buildings across the state, serving about 800, 900 students. At this point, we're serving closer to 650 or 700 students. So we've seen a decline in students that are placed within MSSD. And again, going back to the IEP team decision, and I think
Uh-huh.
we really saw that decline in it and in eligibility and enrollment with MSD come down when they reauthorized IDEA because the Fed said,
Uh-huh.
hey, we need to be more responsible for students and making sure that we have thought through that continuum of placement to make sure it really is appropriate. So from that point on to now, there's been a consistent decline in enrollment
Yeah.
in MSSD. Um, and we'll get to the closures in just a second. But at this point, Missouri is the only state that still operates state schools for students with extensive support needs.
Uh,
So while we were really forward thinking in the 60s
right.
and the legislature, it came about as a state law. The
Mhm.
legislature said, we need to ensure these students have access to an education. Well, now we're coming to the point where we need to ensure that these students have access to an appropriate education. And that may not mean in a separate school placement. It may mean that for some, but I would
Right.
contend that there are fewer students now requiring that level of extensive supports just based on the availability of resources, opportunity, and increased professional development that our teachers can and will continue to grow and be able to provide. It's our job
Mhm.
as a state agency to ensure that they have access to those resources. And so that's
Right.
a big part of MSSD Reimagined. But you're right. With that decline in enrollment, it was no longer appropriate or even feasible for us to operate 34 buildings.
Right.
When I came into this position and there were 34 schools, and remember, I came from one of those schools, I
Mhm.
immediately recognized that not all of those schools were even created equal. And they're all
Uh-huh.
over the state. I mean, I was in Northwest Missouri. We have schools in Southeast, Southwest, Central, Northeast. And enrollment is anywhere from 60 to 80 students. And when I came to this position, we had two schools with fewer than 5 students.
Oh, wow.
And so when you look at that in terms of value, just educational programming value,
Mm.
you're serving 4 students in a school where just for from a safety standpoint, you need 4 adults in that building every day for those four
Right.
students, just so folks can go to lunch and can take a break and get because it's a very intensive job as an educator supporting students with ESN.
Mhm.
There's a lot of physical work, but there's a lot of fatigue that goes into that because you're supporting those students to the highest degree, all the way from daily living skills, bathrooming, changing, feeding, all the way to those most important things, which are educational. And if one of those folks goes on maternity leave for 9 weeks and you can't find a sub, and if one person resigns to take a different position, you can't operate a school anymore with only 2 staff members. And
Right.
so, what we had seen from the time that I came on through about 2.5 years ago is we had, I believe, 4 schools that we had to do emergency consolidations. It was no
Uh-huh.
longer safe from a staffing standpoint to have 5 to 10 students in a building with as few teachers and teacher aides. And we had a lot of building principals that had to drive from one building to another, either on a daily basis or over the course of one day, go to 2 buildings.
Right.
And the same thing was true of nurses, homeschool coordinators, which are a fabulous resource in MSSD. They're social workers to help families get the resources that they need. School secretaries, school cooks. Some of our buildings don't even have kitchens to provide food
Right.
service for our students, and we have to contract with other school districts or work with outside catering to bring food in, which,
Yeah.
again, when you're thinking about educational opportunity, let alone adequacy and access to equitable services for students with disabilities, MSSD was not operating the way it needed to support those
Right.
students. So now we are at a point where we had 3 additional emergency consolidations, and those students, for the most part, with the exception of just a couple students, they all were reassigned to different MSSD schools across the
Uh-huh.
state. So it wasn't like we discontinued services and they had to go back to their local school district. They were given that option. Again, the IEP team makes that decision, not
Right.
MSSD, not Mark Wheatley sitting in the assistant commissioner's office
Right.
dictating all of this. And they remained with us, but also we engaged in a very long and extensive review of MSSD programming. And there are some real challenges that we've already discussed that we found,
Mhm.
and some other challenges and some opportunity for improvement that were necessary. And so, over the course of the last year and a half, we engaged with a group called the Long Range Planning Advisory Committee. It was about 50 stakeholders from across the state. Some of them were
Mhm.
educators and administrators in MSSD. Some were educators and administrators in school districts across the state served by MSSD. And then we had a large group of folks supporting advocacy around people with disabilities, regardless of what area their focus or their expertise was. And in the end,
Yeah.
they produced a group of several recommendations to our state board of education. And they basically said, hey, we think MSSD needs to continue, but we think it needs to change pretty dramatically.
Right.
And we think more students could be served with the school districts and not in these isolated separate placements. And so that's kind of
Uh-huh.
where we are today. And now we have the MSSD Reimagined group that is taking all of those recommendations and putting them into practice in Missouri. So
Mhm.
when I say MSSD Reimagined, I'm really talking about special education in Missouri reimagined, because it
Okay.
changes whole thought behind how we educate students with disabilities in Missouri.
Well, that must be exciting for you as the assistant commissioner for special education in the state to be kind of a big part of that.
It's exciting, but I also go back to the idea that if I'm a parent in one of those schools with MSSD and I hear you're going to close my building down where my child has been in school for 2, 5, 11, 10, 11 years, and
Yeah.
now you're going to close that school down, where's my student going to attend next? What's the transportation time going to be like to go from
Right.
34 to 22 buildings? And is it in the best interest of my child as a parent to look at my local school district and say, hey, can you provide these services now?
Mhm.
That's where the opportunity comes in. But it's also very scary if you're a staff
Yeah.
member in one of those buildings, or if you're a staff member in one of the school districts who haven't served those students in the past. And so I always, have to be very, very cognizant of the fact that while it's really exciting to think about the possibilities for the students, we also have to think about all those other folks that are involved in that work, to know that there's some fear behind that. There's
Yeah.
some misinformation that happens with rumors and things like that that get projected and put out there that are not accurate statements. And so
Mhm.
part of my job and the job of MSSD, they have a superintendent of schools just like every other school district does. Their responsibility is to make sure that parents, educators, school districts are fully informed of the work that's going on. And yeah, once they understand the challenges and see the opportunity, then they can begin to get excited as well.
So, um, maybe we could shift gears. I think that's super interesting, but there's something else I think we want to get at, which is, we keep hearing that over the past year or so, that there are changes happening at the federal level in just education and special education as a result. And we're just wondering that, you know, from the state level, how are those federal changes affecting education policy or just affecting Missouri?
That's a really good question. I think there's a lot of noise right now related to, potential different interagencies agreements that are happening at the federal level that certain parts of the Department of Education are moving to the Department of Labor, moving to other areas.
Mhm.
Um, Ultimately, what I think is critical is what we did talk about at the very beginning. We have a federal law,
Yeah.
IDEA, that doesn't have wiggle room,
Mhm.
and it bestows upon the states the opportunity, but also the responsibility to ensure that students with disabilities receive a free and appropriate public education. So, not to say this flippantly, but
Yeah.
it doesn't matter as much to me where that office is in the US
Mhm.
Department of Education or in the Department of Labor, though I would contend that we need to stay focused on education because that's what we're talking about in this instance. Our work
Yeah.
in Missouri doesn't change.
Yeah.
The law doesn't change. Missouri's state plan for special education, which reflects IDEA, but it's our local state plan of our requirements and regulations around how we do business in Missouri, meaning that we have to at least provide all the same guardrails that IDEA does, but we can
Mhm.
even provide more support and have higher requirements and regulations above and beyond if we choose to do so in the benefit of students. Now, we do that in a lot of ways with stakeholders and those things, but we're lucky enough to have that as our guiding light, if you will. We're going to follow IDEA in Missouri.
You're right.
Nothing is going to change in Missouri as far as what we expect school districts to do to serve students with disabilities. Our
Mhm.
expectations for how those services are delivered will remain consistent. And we have no reason and have not seen any indication that our funding from the federal level is going to change in that
Yeah.
category. In fact, we've been lucky enough to have a pretty steady funding over several years, multiple administrations,
Mhm.
and special education um, is the cornerstone for what we do here in the Office of Special Education, and IDEA
Yeah.
puts that spot on. So for us, it's business as usual.
Mhm.
Um, but I certainly understand it's the same thing. I think there's a lot of fear from the standpoint of parents. There's a lot of fear from educators going, well, what if something changes here? But FAPE is a free and appropriate public education, and we're still required to provide that in Missouri, and we will
Yeah.
continue to do that unless somebody tells us that that legislation of IDEA no longer exists, and that would be just a huge event that I don't think we're ready to even consider.
Margaret, a couple of times you've hit on just either misinformation or concerns from parents or educators about how either whether it's the federal changes happening with the Department of Education or even just the changes that are happening in Missouri with the special school districts. What would you tell, or what do you tell or encourage parents and families to do when they are curious? They want to know more about what's happening. They want to understand how changes might impact their student or their family. How do you help people navigate misinformation or scary headlines, or and kind of provide that information and reassurance?
Yeah, so from the state operated programs in the schools, MSSD, Missouri School for the Blind, and Missouri School for the Deaf. Those are all three state operated programs right now. Missouri School for the Deaf and Blind only operate one building. MSB is located in St. Louis, and Missouri School for the Deaf is located just north of us in Fulton, Missouri. But all three of those organizations have developed a very sound communication plan, and MSSD has really bolstered their communication plan to ensure that they have all of the information on the MSSD website. And so you can go to the Office of Special Education website with DESE and then drill down to get to Missouri Schools for the Severely Disabled to learn about that piece. You can also just go to the Office of Special Education website on DESE's website, and you can see all of our initiatives that we are doing in our office here to ensure students with disabilities receive FAPE, that free appropriate public education. You can see things like our application for Part B federal funds, and that's part of what we talked about earlier from the U.S. Department of Ed, and how Missouri outlines its responsibilities to students with disabilities. You can look at the professional development that's out there for educators, the resources that are available to parents around just generally what's going on in Missouri special education. And I would always encourage families first, though, to reach out to their local school districts. That's their point of contact. Even if they
Right.
come to MSSD or Missouri School for the Blind or Missouri School for the Deaf, they are students of those local school districts first. And those
Oh,
LEAs, those school districts are responsible for providing a free and appropriate public education. They just happen to decide as an IEP team that the placement and the services should be done in the state operated schools if they decide that. There are also options for families and or students with disabilities to attend private agencies. And so school districts can contract with private agencies to provide special education services. Those are typically students that even have more advanced extensive support needs than the students that MSSD would serve.
mm,
Some of them even serve in a residential capacity that they're, because of their disability, they may have limited opportunity to live with their family because of the level of care that's required and the level of need and resources that are available. And so some of those students are residential. Missouri School for the Blind and Missouri School for the Deaf are residential programs during the week, but they go home to their families on the weekend. That's a little different, but that's still on the continuum of placement is still much further away from being inside your local school district most of the time. And so there are all of those options across that spectrum. So it's really important that parents know that their local school district is their educator for their child, even if they aren't served in that school district. That still makes up the majority of the IEP team when it comes to making the decisions for that student and for their child. So families have to stay in contact with their local school districts. And if they need more information about some of the things that are going on in those other placements, then those placements can provide that additional communication and support. But yeah, it's really critical.
yeah. Looks like Amelia dropped today for our listeners. I guess on YouTube, you'll see that she's dropping in and out, but weird internet today in Kansas City. Anyway, um, Mark, it's just been great. I've learned a ton just from our
Thank you.
conversation. So I really appreciate it. If people do want to get more information about you or about special education, um, where can they go?
Yeah, again, so I'll point them right back to the Missouri Department of Education
Yeah,
website. The
yeah,
website just had a very significant facelift, and the goal there wasn't just about accessibility, which now we've come to a point where our website is very accessible for people with disabilities. Color contrast, text, all those features that are essential, regardless
yeah,
of disability, are built into the website. But even more importantly, or as importantly as that, I shouldn't say more importantly, as importantly as that is how you're able to access information on our website. If you talk to folks, me included, it was hard
uh-huh,
for me to navigate the Office of Special Education's website. Our
right,
office about 2 years ago undertook a pretty extensive project to make sure that if you needed to find something on the Office of Special Education under DESE's website, you could get
mm,
there in 2 to 3 clicks.
yeah,
Before that project, it was 5, 6, 7 clicks, and
yeah,
that's a challenge. People turn off and they just go,
yeah,
"Okay, I can't find it, so I'm just gonna move on or pick up the phone." There are other resources, but if families or educators in those school districts or even, private school educators or other placement, if they have information or need information about special education in Missouri around rules, compliance, effective practice, teaching and learning, they can reach out to our office via phone and they can work with one of our compliance supervisors. We have those folks
mhm,
on call here during regular business hours, Monday through Friday. If they can't get you an answer, and chances are they can really pretty quickly, they'll get back to you with a follow up email. We also have different options on the DESE website around, some interactive opportunities for almost like a text mechanism to be able to
mhm,
engage with the Department of Ed, but it's much more user friendly now, much easier to read and understand. And hopefully, we're getting out there. What's important is making sure that all of our customers, whether they're family members, school district officials, teachers, grandmas and grandpas, they want to know about their child's education. they need to be able to access that information on DESE's website. So they can do that now. You'll also see links to our social media accounts for the Department of Ed, and those are available there.
All right. Well, thank you so much for giving us all your time today. We really appreciate it.
No, I appreciate the opportunity. It's a blast to talk about special education in Missouri because we are moving in a very positive direction. And you could tell in my conversation, I'm sure, like, that guy's pretty animated, but it really is exciting. Even though we talk about those potential challenges and fears, we're moving in a very positive direction. And I think the sky's the limit. And we know that about our students. We want them to have post-secondary success. And I think we're in a good place in Missouri to continue those efforts to improve.
Great. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Accessible. Accessible is hosted and produced by George Gatto, Amelia Reigard, and Catherine Toller from the University of Missouri Kansas City Institute for Human Development, which is the home of the Missouri USED. Accessible is a joint project between the Missouri USED and the Missouri LEND program, which is funded by the Health Resources and Services Administration of the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services through grant number T73MC00022. Episodes of Accessible are released every 2 weeks and can be found wherever you subscribe to your podcasts. Join us next time to hear more insights and ideas from leaders in the disability world.